My name is Adam Stocker, and I'm a first hand, which is a cutter prepper in costume making.
This is Adam, and he creates the costumes you see on stage and screen. He has worked in the costuming industry for over 5 years on various projects, from Shakespeare in the Park to Six the Musical on Broadway to Dickinson on Apple TV. Throughout this time, he shared his experiences through his blog on Instagram, showcasing the daily ins and outs of his job. Yet, there is so much more to the world of film and theater costuming than what appears on the surface. Okay, but let's start with the basics first. How does a costume for a show get put together in the first place?
You have your production, and the designer is part of the production. And then the designer finds a costume shop to make their costumes. So then the designer gives their designs to the costume shop, and the pattern maker in the costume shop figures out how to make a two-dimensional drawing into a three-dimensional garment. And then we make what's called a mock-up out of fabric that is not the real fabric. And then so you make the pattern, someone cuts it out, it's usually me, and then somebody sews it together. And then you have your mock-up. Then you schedule a fitting with the actor and the designer, and you figure out all of the problems or all of the things that don't work. And then you go fix your pattern, and then you schedule another fitting in the real fabric. And then sometimes there's like a final look fitting.
And that's a necessity, especially with a high-profile stage like Broadway. It's the couture of costume making. Everything has to be perfect, or at least to the highest quality possible. However, costume makers like Adam don't exactly have all the time in the world to achieve this state of perfection either.
In theater, in general, it being a fast-paced environment comes with the industry. Costume making specifically, it also comes with the industry, but with the caveat of most of the time, the theaters will think of costumes last in the production. So oftentimes, the costume department gets the least amount of money, and they almost always get the least amount of time to make things happen. And that is because of producers' understanding of clothing or lack thereof. So when you are able to go to a store and buy something off the rack, it's really hard for people to understand how long it takes to make a dress, or how long it takes to make a suit, or how long it takes to make a costume for 6. But oftentimes people want that in like 2 days. And so you're like, so you have to explain to them that making a dress doesn't necessarily happen in 2 days, even though we often make it happen in 2 days because we're only given that amount of time. So it's this cyclical ordeal of like, that is not how much time I need to make this garment, but it's the only amount of time I have, so I either have to make it or not have a job.
With this much pressure and not that much reward, one would expect high burnout and turnover rates in this industry, but this pattern isn't necessarily reflected. At least, not until recently.
It was not that high pre-lockdown. Now that we've had like plenty of like workers' uprisings, it's a pretty high turnover rate. So since we've come back from lockdown, at least where I work, 6 people have quit, which is a lot considering nobody quit since I started 5 years ago. I think we came back from the pandemic understanding that our bosses were going to help us fight a little bit harder for more time and more money. And they have been, with like little success, but big change doesn't necessarily happen overnight, especially in an industry that is as old as theater, that is as old and as antiquated as theaters. theater likes to live a little bit in the past, which is why we're so slow to use like new technology. So those old-timey sentiments are like really deeply rooted in theater, where it's like we pay costume people less because it's women's work and because it's also a lot of immigrant labor.
Garment workers have historically been exploited, especially in the age of rapidly growing consumerism. For instance, let's take a look back at the late 1800s and early 1900s, during the height of the Gilded Age. Here's a quote by Abraham Kahn, an American newspaper editor in the early 1890s. Here, he describes the long hours and low pay with enormous work expectations endured by many immigrant garment laborers during that time.
They say a day has 24 hours. That's a bluff. A day has 12 coats. I have still 2 coats to make of the 12 that I got yesterday. So it's still Monday with me. My Tuesday won't begin before about 2 o'clock this afternoon.
Although most of today's garment sweatshops have mostly been moved overseas to countries like India or China, the ideology still exists, but in a slightly different form. Despite technological innovations and leaps in labor laws and protections, the fact that many still utilize immigrant labor and underpay their workers is a pattern that remains unchanged. With recent impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, things seem to be changing faster than ever, and hopefully for the better. With Broadway being shuttered for over a year, many workers relied on government-issued stimulus checks, and pressure has been placed on the employers to raise their pay or risk losing their employees. This gave low-wage workers across all backgrounds across the country the potential for greater bargaining power with their employers.
Yeah, because of COVID, we were shut down kind of indefinitely. While Broadway, especially Broadway shut down, but it was like if Broadway shut down, then we were super not important because we were just making costumes for future shows. And at that time, we were like, we'll be closed for like 3 weeks and then come back to work. And then obviously, it was for a full like year and a half before everybody came back to work. But so then I came back in January of 2021, and it was me, my pattern maker, one stitcher, and then like our boss. And that was the only, like we were the only people there for a long time until we slowly, until film and TV came back kind of first. And so they would call us and be like, we need some alterations done. And then maybe call in another person. And then like slowly but surely, we called everybody back. And now so then when Broadway announced its reopening, we were like, oh gosh, we better get moving on the costumes that have been sitting on our tables for a year and a half.
It's hard to ignore the discrepancies in this divide, especially when it's evident in many aspects of theater. Not only costuming. With social justice being such a prevalent issue this past year, it's important to recognize that they don't just go away, even with representation being something audiences have asked for in the theater and film they consume.
Yeah, right, it's almost a trick. It's like Broadway isn't necessarily casting different people in the same role. They're casting the same type of person in the same role. They're just casting the original Broadway cast member as that size or with a different skin color, really.
Yet, within costuming, the discrepancies are even more powerful and clear.
The business owners are almost all white. There are like a few not white business owners. Okay. The first hands are almost all white. And the pattern makers, like I said, are like all white in skin color, but a lot of them can also be immigrants from Ukraine or Russia or Poland or like the Eastern European area. But they're most often tailors as opposed to dressmakers. The stitchers, if you don't know Spanish, you're not gonna be able to communicate with the stitchers in a costume shop in New York City. But the white people are always in the position of power, right? So they're the business owners, they're the me who tells the stitcher what to do. And it is weird, like coming in as a 20, like when I started working, I was like 23, and I was telling this like 60-year-old woman who speaks Spanish what to do. But in reality, if you did something wrong, they'll bring it back to you and say this is wrong. You need to repin it this way, or you need to recut it this way for me. Because they have 40 years of the industry under their belt, and they totally know better. And I know I talked about the exploitation of immigrant labor before. I didn't use the word exploitation, but it's exploiting immigrant labor. When you need things done really, really fast in a short amount of time, and your workforce is non-union immigrant labor, it's exploitation. It's hard to feel bad for billionaires when I make $20 an hour, which is like barely getting me through New York City rent and food and travel. Like, you know, I make $20 an hour. Not all of the stitchers make $20 an hour. And that is upsetting on like a lot of different levels.
On the other hand, there are many positives about this job too.
But my favorite piece that I worked on is it's a dress for the drag queen Peppermint in Head Over Heels, the musical that was on Broadway. This was like my first huge project with my boss. I worked directly with my boss, and him and I made this costume happen. And it was a lot of work for me as like a newer person in New York City and in the industry, and it was a lot of like me figuring out what it meant to be an adult working and living in New York City, and then also working with like a high-profile client and seeing how amazing it was on stage and how gorgeous it was.
And ultimately, that's the reason why they do it. It's the pride of seeing their work of art showcased on stage every night on the Great White Way, in front of an audience of theater goers, and maybe even inspiring the next generation of artists.
If you liked this video, make sure to hit like, comment, and subscribe to keep up to date with all of our RealWorks YouTube videos. And don't forget to watch the films of the next generation of filmmakers.